This is Fiona Cuthbertson coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. Today we're lucky enough to be speaking to Baroness Randerson, a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords. Baroness Randerson was elected as Assembly member for Cardiff Central in 1999, beating future First Minister Mark Drakeford. During her time on the Welsh Assembly, she spent time as the Minister for Culture, Sport and the Welsh Language, Minister for Health, and also spent time as Acting Deputy First Minister during the Liberal Democrat Labour partnership government from 2000 to 2003. She's been a member of the House of Lords since 2011 and was a minister in the Wales office during the Cameron-Clegg coalition. This means that she's the first female Welsh Liberal Democrat to hold ministerial office at Westminster and in Wales, and also the first Welsh Liberal to hold a ministerial post since Gwilym Lloyd George in 1945. And of course, at the moment, she holds the position of Transport Spokesman for the Lib Dems. Welcome, Baroness Randerson.
Good morning.
So thank you very much for coming along. That's quite a journey. Can you tell us a bit about how it all came about?
Oh, delighted to try, Fiona. It all happened totally by chance. I joined the Liberal Party, as it then was, at a time of a general election, 1979. I wasn't planning to join it. I was more or less persuaded to by my husband. But campaigning in my local neighbourhood and campaigning for specific issues. My very first campaign was about the safety of a footpath that was being used by motorcyclists. My enthusiasm was caught by it. So there was no big plan, there was no ambition. You can't really be ambitious if you're a Liberal, or you couldn't at that point. But there was great personal satisfaction in doing things in my neighbourhood. And then I got caught up in the enthusiasm of campaigning. And when you put a lot of time into it, you do inevitably want to win.
Absolutely. And how does being a member of the Welsh Assembly compare to your time in the Lords?
Oh, it was totally different. The two things are at the opposite extremes. The Assembly in 1999 was informal. It was making up the rules as it went along because it was starting off. We were all trying something new. And the Assembly is, of course, very small. On the other hand, the Lords is very old, not just the people in it, but the institution itself is hundreds of years old. It's got rules that go back hundreds of years, and the purpose behind a lot of them has long ago been forgotten, but we still obey them. And the whole institution represents a history, the history of the UK. So because the Assembly was small, we all had to do lots of different things in any 1 week. There was never a meeting when you didn't speak. The House of Lords is completely different. You specialise. It's full of experts, and more or less everyone does specialise in a number of small areas that they tend to know a great deal about. So in so many ways, they are completely contrasting. And actually, starting off in the Assembly was very demanding. Starting off in the House of Lords was terrifying.
It's so very interesting to hear about your time in the Welsh Assembly. Obviously, there has been so much change within it recently. Looking at it now as an outsider with so much knowledge, do you have a view of what's been going on?
The Senate has been through a demanding time recently. It's been through controversies that it hasn't faced before. I think that's very difficult in a small institution, but I was really pleased looking in a non-political way from the outside of the Senate now. I was really pleased to see that we now have our first female First Minister. I think that's important that she is now doing a good job, that she is bringing people together again, I hope, in order to make the Senate a great deal more effective than when it's divided.
What's been the highlight of your career so far?
I think the highlight of my career has got to be becoming a minister. Becoming a minister, first of all, in Wales, and then becoming a minister in the coalition government in London. Because you spend years as a politician campaigning for particular policies, particular issues, and so on. Of course, the highlight is when you can actually start to put them into practice. You talk about things as a politician, you campaign for them, you want to do them. And being a minister, for all its huge challenges and difficulties and frustrations, actually having the power to do something, to improve things for people, is a highlight.
What is the hardest challenge you've had to overcome in your career so far?
I think my hardest challenge was when I was first a member of Welsh Assembly, because getting started in a new job is always difficult. A new job as Assembly member for Cardiff Central, as I then was a job no one had ever done before. So I couldn't look at the past and see what had happened. There was a strong view that we weren't going to be just pale imitations of MPs, that it was going to be different, and that's as it's worked out. And I think it really was, as the first ever Welsh Assembly member for Cardiff Central, I felt I had no one to learn from. I had a whole load of new colleagues, most of whom I didn't know. And as I said earlier on, making up the rules as we went along. That was challenging.
And having made the rules up as you went along at that time, what is the most important lesson you've learned over your career?
Oh, I think the most important lesson for a politician to learn is always to be a good listener. People don't think politicians necessarily listen, but I think if you're going to be successful as a politician, you have to listen. You have to listen for a long time. You have to listen across the board before you really understand any problem. And then you make up your mind as to what you're going to do.
So do you think that is a common myth about politicians, that they don't listen and that they just have an opinion going into a situation that they won't change?
I think it is a myth, and I think it's probably true of some, but I think there are far more listeners out there than the public give us credit for. And that's not a party political thing. It's a general view that I talk to some very thoughtful politicians from all parties. That doesn't mean they're all perfect by any means, but we do try and listen before we speak, most of us.
You've been interested in all things transport for a very long time. What do you think is the most important policy development that's been made by the government of any colour since you've been in the Lords?
I think it's got to be the setting of the 2030 date for the end of the sale of diesel and petrol cars. In a world where we face huge challenges in terms of carbon emissions, we have a solution to one small part of the jigsaw. The 2030 date was set. It was one of those environmental promises that was taken up enthusiastically by the automobile industry. And then, of course, it was changed to 2035 by Boris Johnson's government when they thought that the public were not ready for it. Now that, astonishingly to them, upset the automobile industry no end. The automobile industry didn't turn around and say, oh, thank goodness we haven't got to do that by 2030. They turned around and said, but we were all geared up and ready to do it by 2030. And I think the current government is looking again at this, and I do think we could still retrieve a lot of that promise. And Norway, for example, has shown that if you've got the will, you can do it. It's not just about carbon emissions. It's very, very much about air quality, and poor air quality affects all sorts of aspects of our health, and particularly of children's health. So I think it's really important we go ahead with it.
And working as a woman in a sector where males have traditionally dominated, do you think enough work is being done to change the demographics?
It takes ages to get used to the male domination. Enough isn't being done to challenge the male domination. I think there is a lot more that some of the players in the industry can do. There are some companies doing amazing stuff, But I think we need to start much earlier on in the school cycle. So girls are doing the right subjects to the end of their school education. We should be getting more girls into traineeships within the transport industry. I think a lot of people still have the same attitudes that they had in the days of greasing the vehicles and stoking the boilers and so on. It isn't like that. It is a much cleaner industry now, and it's perfect for many women, I think, to operate in, both as engineers and as drivers and so on. Or it could be perfect. There needs to be a much more positive attitude. And one of the things I think we need to be doing as politicians, speaking within the transport industry, is to talk far less about points and train sets and junctions and that sort of thing, and very much more about the way in which that impacts the passenger. I talk about passengers all the time. I was talking yesterday in the House of Lords specifically about passengers on the railway. We recently had a bill going through Parliament, Railway Passenger Services Bill. And at the second reading, which is the initial debate about it, there were 25 plus men in the debate and 5 women. One of the 5 women was the minister. The other 4 women were the Lib Dem transport team. I was really, really proud of that. Our proposed amendments came through about passengers, about fares, and about disability access. They're the sort of things that attract women into a topic. And I think if we emphasised the importance of the passenger comfort, passenger journeys and standards, I think we'd get much more interest from women in the industry in general, and therefore more women involved within the industry.
One of the projects that I'm actually working on at the moment is violence against women and girls on trains. There is the nationalisation, so the safety is going to come under the government's remit now, having been with the ORR. The sector is looking to use lighting to reduce this as an issue. How do you think the government needs to engage in order to make sure that violence against women and girls on trains is reduced?
I think this is a key thing that government ought to be looking at immediately, because they're just about to write what we've been referring to as the big bill, the legislation that's just gone through the Lords and the Commons, just gradually renationalises railways. But nationalisation isn't a silver bullet. So you've got to have all the details of how it's going to be run in the future. And safety is absolutely crucial. Unless people feel safe, they are not going to be willing to travel on the railways, and they're certainly not going to be willing to work on the railways. So obviously, innovative solutions are welcome, and things like lighting is a very good way of doing it. More CCTV and so on is a good way of ensuring safety. But there's nothing quite as reassuring as having crew on the train walking up and down and people on your local station when you're standing there waiting to catch the train in the dark in the evening.
Transport has always been seen as quite fragmented. Do you think consistency of service for passengers, ensuring things like safety, will happen under the new big bill, as you put it?
Well, the Minister, Lord Hendy, who knows a few things about railways and has huge respect from the House of Lords across parties, has made it absolutely clear that in his experience, fragmentation is a huge problem. And nationalisation is a solution to that, but it's not a silver bullet, because if people are still working in silos, as they could be, even within a nationalised industry, you are not going to get that coordination. So the big bill that we're looking forward to, probably at the end of next year, has got to address putting all those things together. So, for example, key thing, when something goes wrong and you get a notice from your local train operator as to the fact that the trains are delayed, it always essentially allocates blame, doesn't it? Either to something that is the fault of the train operator, or it allocates blame essentially to what's now Network Rail. We've really got to do away with that blame culture, that blame process, which is all the cost of it's going to fall, and just do away with any other view other than we've all got to work together in order to improve the service. But we've already had one important amendment accepted, and that probably hasn't been public knowledge yet. And that is, we got an amendment through by Baroness Randerson that was also signed by Tanni Grey-Thompson, by David Blunkett, Lord Blunkett, and Lord Holmes, who is a Conservative peer who is blind. And that amendment was accepted by the government, and they now take responsibility for dealing with disabled passengers and giving them equality of service. Now, that's a huge step forward because it's not only a big responsibility and a complex issue, it's going to cost a great deal of money to railways. Of course, it's not going to be perfect overnight, but they have accepted that legal responsibility now. It's now in legislation, and it's absolutely brilliant that we've made that progress forward.
Indeed, and actually Louise Hay did say that within the next year another 36 stations were going to become accessible to disabled people. It's very interesting to hear about the change that you managed to instigate within this bill through working cross-party. It is often key to getting the change needed. Do you think that it is one of the best examples of change that you have seen regarding working cross-party happen in practice?
Well, I think it's a very, very good example because it was 4 parties. It was led by Baroness Brinton, as I said, Sal Brinton, who is a Liberal Democrat, and she is a wheelchair user. And so she and Tanni Grey-Thompson often was a crossbencher, often worked very closely together on disability issues, and to bring in both Labour and Conservative members as well to get that complete consensus is the way in which the House of Lords tries to work on many occasions. Like so many other big issues in life, they don't have party political boundaries, do they? The interests, the issues, the impact of them goes right across.
And if you were Secretary of State for Transport, what would be the first thing you would change?
Well, the first thing I would do would be to put significant investment into the railways in order to deal with the fares system, because so much of sorting the railways has to take the time it will take to get the new organisation up and running. But the bit about the railways you can do is sorting out the fares. So if the government can please start to ensure that the fares are simpler, and above all, that it is a lot easier and clearer as to how you buy your train tickets, whether you're doing it online or at a machine at the station, so that you can be sure that you always get your cheapest fare. I reckon I know quite a lot about railway fares, and as a regular train traveller, I do it several times a week. You'd think I would understand, but earlier this week it took me a good 20 minutes to sort out what I was being offered on a new display on an online application I was making. So I think really that for ordinary travellers wanting to go occasionally rather than regularly, the fare system is still far too complex. There's no reason why it can't be sorted really quickly.
So are you going to be lobbying the government on that for the new bill?
Oh, I will be. I have been for a very long time, but I will be doing it and continue to do it. And yesterday in our debates, the Minister said, and he said, I promise I will be working with the Baroness and discussing how to do it. So I've got someone willing to listen to me.
That's marvellous. And of course, as we've said before, cooperation is key. And you need to engage those on the coalface to ensure plans actually work. So do you think at the moment enough is done by the ministry and department, and what else would you do?
You know, in the last decade or so, the Department for Transport has not been engaging enough. We now have in Lord Hendy someone who knows enough about the problems to be not afraid of engaging. He has a reputation for working across parties, for being willing to tell it as it is. So he's not afraid of going out and talking to people. And people respect when he is critical of their point of view. People respect that he does it with some knowledge of the situation. So I think that we have an opportunity here for greater transparency, more consultation, and not just consulting, but listening. There was a wonderful example, actually, of the importance of consultation last year, wasn't there? When the government proposed closing the ticket office.
Yes.
The public just
Revolted.
responded resoundingly with, oh, no, you don't. And the government dropped it. Now, there is rarely a consultation that brings one response quite like that. It was a wonderful example of how a bad idea got squashed very quickly. And there are all sorts of other difficult problems that are much more subtle in terms of their answer. But the government needs to go out and talk to us all.
So are you positive for the future of transport in the UK and the UK in general?
To be honest, I've been sounding fairly positive, haven't I? But I think we have huge problems in Britain. We've had some really bad economic news in recent months. We face a major challenge as a country which is densely populated. And densely populated countries only survive economically and thrive economically if they have excellent transport systems. You really cannot say that's true of Britain. If you look at us and compare us with our closest neighbours in Europe, first of all, Brexit caused us to face big challenges, but essentially have failed to recover from both Brexit and from the impact of COVID. In comparison with our neighbours, we haven't recovered from COVID. And government is always telling us, and the previous government told us as well, that, we haven't got people back in work as we should. Well, why don't people want to go to work? There are all sorts of hassles in just getting to work for so many people because our transport systems aren't good. It's difficult to get goods into the shops because the transport systems aren't good. It's difficult for our economy to thrive unless we have excellent infrastructure and communications. And I'd like to be optimistic. I'm afraid I am hopeful rather than optimistic.
And of course, key to that is going to be working together. So on that, we come to the end of another interview. And thank you, Baroness Randerson, for taking the time to speak today. And thank you to the listeners of the podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel that you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.